Today I'm joined by Andreas Kling. Now, I have actually covered some of Andreas's work before, but we've not had Andreas specifically on. So let's talk a little bit about the project that we're here to talk about, which is Ladybird. But I think as part of that, it'd be interesting to describe how you got to Ladybird, because it started with something else first. So
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it all started a very long time ago, when I was a web developer in the 2005, around that time. And I was also a Linux user. And I worked at this little small business doing websites for our local companies in my little hometown. And because I loved Linux so much, I was always using these like random open source browsers and stuff like that. And I would always test our websites that we were making in like Conqueror and Firefox. And nobody else cared about this. And I was probably the only user who ever visited the websites with those browsers, but it was still, I don't know, it was fun. And
yeah. Do you remember iCab?
I do remember it. Yeah, but I didn't use it.
There might have been a Mac only one, but you're right. There was a lot more back in the day.
Indeed. No, I was using Conqueror mostly. And at some point, I was working on a website for a customer, like a local print shop or something like that. And there was some problem on the site in Conqueror. And I thought, you know what? People always say that open source is so great because you can edit the code. So I guess what I should do now is just edit the code of the browser, right? And I went and I downloaded the code for the browser and tried to figure out how to fix the problem I was having. And I was actually able to do it. And it was exhilarating. And I think I became a browser developer that day. And 20 years later, I am still doing that kind of stuff. And it's been a long journey since then. You know, I didn't go into browsers professionally at first. I worked as a sort of systems developer in Sweden for a long time, working on embedded systems in the textile industry. But then eventually I ended up at Nokia working on browsers there.
Ah, okay, interesting. I just finished an article on the legacy of Nokia. Had I known, I could have included you in that. So did you work on like Symbian?
No, I worked in Oslo. We were part of this sort of acquisition of the Qt project that Nokia did.
Course, yes. Oh, yes. That makes a lot of sense to some of your project code then. Okay, yeah.
So I ended up at Nokia in the Qt department. And because I had some browser experience, they decided to put me in the Qt WebKit team. And eventually that turned into the foundation of a browser that Nokia was doing for the N9 Linux-based phone, which was a one-off in the end because of what ended up happening with Nokia. But when Nokia announced that they were going to use Windows as a platform for their phones, you know, everybody, we were all hearing about it in the cafeteria at Nokia, and like we all looked at each other, and everybody sort of understood that we're all getting new jobs now, right? Because we were all Linux nerds, and nobody wanted to use Windows.
Well, neither did anybody else on the phone, so it's like
that's it kind of turned out that way, I
guess. In fact, they wanted to use Linux,
as it turned out.
So sort of, anyway.
Yeah, but it was less obvious at the time, I suppose.
Yeah, it was. It's funny because we are two slightly older people, maybe talking about some of this stuff. But I remember both of your reference points. One, you know, back in the early 2000s when there were a lot more browsers. And two, when everybody was trying to make a mobile operating system, from Nokia to Canonical to Mozilla, and they all kind of failed. And I think this actually leads very nicely into Ladybird in some respects. It's like, why now? I think it's almost the same justification. It's like, why make another browser? Because there aren't enough successful ones, really.
Indeed.
So, you know, yeah. But before we get to that, let's just go back one quick step, because before Ladybird, you were working on Serenity. It would be interesting because many people would also wonder, like, why on earth did you do Serenity? Because it was another operating system. So quickly, what was Serenity? Why was Serenity? And what's happened to it? I
Sure.
suppose.
So Serenity was, or is, an operating system. And it's sort of where I was going with the previous thing. So I'll speed up the segue. But we all left Nokia, myself included, and we just walked on to appropriate teams at other big companies. I found one at Apple, or they found me, or however that worked out.
Yeah.
And it was easy to find jobs doing browsers at the time. And then I spent 6-7 years at Apple working on their browsers. And at some point, I quit in 2017 because I was tired of the industry. I didn't feel at home. I didn't feel sufficiently American to work at such an American company. And and I quit and got back to just living in Sweden, didn't have a plan. And then things went a little bit sideways, or very sideways, because I had been also developing a drug problem on the side of this. And drug problem plus unemployment is really not productive. And that went exactly as you think it would. So I think I managed just under a year before I ended up in a state rehab program. And I had to go through a process. This based on the it was a treatment program based on the 12-step program, and it was really good and really humbling to go through that and to I joined this recovery community in my hometown where I lived at the time, and just engage with other people from all walks of life with the same problem. And I came out of there just feeling very different about everything. And there was no way I could go back to a cushy tech job at that point.
I couldn't possibly comment. I sort of have similar feeling myself. It's hard to go back sometimes when you spend some time away.
Yeah.
So is that where the name Serenity comes from? Was it maybe like a state
Indeed.
of mind at the time?
That's kind of what it was. Yeah. So I tried to figure out what to do, because after rehab was like 6 hours a day, every day. And when that ended, what was I supposed to do? I now had this full empty days with nothing to do, and all this energy. And I just needed something to do. So I just started programming, which is what I always do. And I started building an operating system because I thought that would be fun.
It's what everyone's going to try at some point, isn't it? Or a compiler.
I think it's exactly right. It's one of those things that everybody kind of wants to do, but we make excuses like, oh, I don't have enough time for that, or I don't have the right skill set, or whatever. But there I was, and like my big problem was that I had too much time. So the excuse I'd been using my whole life, like, oh, I don't have time to build an operating system, that just didn't fit anymore. So I kind of ended up doing it. And I decided to name it Serenity because I had learned the Serenity Prayer in the 12-step program. And I thought that I was very scared at the time. I'm scared that I would regress, and get back into old habits, and have a relapse. So I figured if I name the project Serenity, I'm just going to have to look at that every day, and I will become like permanently associated with it if it goes public, and everybody will always say, hey, there's that Serenity guy. And I won't be able to escape from that association. And I thought this would be good for me. It's like shutting the back door, bolting the lock.
Yeah. And it was pretty successful was pretty successful as a project, considering, there's a lot of operating systems as well. What do you think some of the reasons for that were?
Yeah, so it was successful, and I think there are a bunch of different reasons. So it's all from scratch, which appeals to hackers for sure. It's all in a mono repo, so it's like one big repository has all the code for everything. It's very easy to get into. And once you're in that world, you can traverse laterally from like kernel code to photo editing to file management or whatever. And it's all in one big pile. Another thing that I did was I used the visual style of Windows 2000, which I think is also very appealing to the same demographic. I think
it made me think a little bit of even older systems because they were more, fairly ahead of their time, like, even latter versions of Amiga OS or something like that.
Yeah. But like those sort of 90s computer systems, 90s office productivity software. Because I grew up using computers that were, I didn't have my own computer growing up. I had my parents' like work computers.
Yep.
So what I was used to was just like office software. Gray. Yeah,
Gray.
Exactly. Gray. And if you look closely, it's actually a slightly beige shade of gray.
So it's a combination of two operating systems.
Indeed.
Although, I don't know, I've got macOS in front of me and it's kind of more gray than beige these days anyway.
Yeah. Well, they let you choose nowadays. They have a dark mode as well.
True. It's true.
But yeah,
anyway.
So those things were big. And there was a third component as well. So there was the everything from scratch and the 90s Microsoft look. But the third thing is that I made YouTube videos about it. So I would just record myself working on the system and just narrate out loud what I was thinking. And it turns out there was an audience for that. I had no idea that there would be when I started, but I kind of did it originally just as a way to challenge myself to be on camera because I was shy and I'd been living sort of a reclusive life, hiding my habits from people. So I thought, hey, I'll go on camera. I'll talk out loud, everything, and put it on the internet. Anybody can look at it. It'll be healthy for me. And that really resonated with people. And a community sort of formed around this. And there's almost like a two-sided community. There's like thousands of people who worked on the project because they liked the project, and thousands of people who watched the videos but never touched the project. So I had the fortunate, I don't know how to say, like, I feel very lucky that what I was doing was interesting to people because I feel like it helped me greatly in my recovery to have this sort of huge accountability network suddenly to keep myself on track. And so the project became quite successful. I think it's well over 1,000 contributors at this point. And it has remained to this day a sort of kindergarten for developers. Or there was never any intent to release it as a product. It was more like, let's have a place where we can work on programming, experiment. Have a good time, hang out and talk. And turns out a lot of people really like that. So there still has never been a release of Serenity OS, but
oh, really? I mean, it works, quote
unquote. Yeah, if you have the right kind of hardware that somebody else happens to have.
I got it to work a couple of years, whatever it was. I messed around with it. I can't remember, and that was on Apple Silicon, which is probably complicated enough as it is. So it worked. It worked. Yeah. So what was Ladybird still is, I suppose, but was the browser part of Serenity. What was the justification to break it out? Was it that maybe that was just a chapter of your life that was now kind of closed, or that you recognized the browser was probably the thing that was most important maybe and could be a viable project in itself?
Right. So there were a couple of factors. The first one was that at some point I realized that we have these two massive projects, like a complete operating system and a complete web browser. And they're sharing this tiny little space. And initially, people would work on both things sort of in harmony. But over time, especially after we ported Ladybird to Linux and Mac OS, the project sort of, how do you say, bifurcated or like split in two, sort of? I don't know.
Because you mentioned someone or somewhere I saw said Serenity forked, which sounded strange terminology to use for me because fork means something a little different.
Right.
Usually.
But in this case, we did
Yeah.
fork it. So
Okay.
in order for the project to make sense, we had to separate these things because at this time, there were like hundreds of people working on the operating system and hundreds of people working on the browser. And there was very little overlap. And so they all had to sort of put up with each other. And like if you wanted to make a change to the browser, you had to also run all of the kernel tests and all that stuff. And like vice versa. Like if you were working on the kernel, you had to run all the browser tests. And people didn't want to care about both things so much. And it was a drain on resources, time. So we forked it. And that was one aspect of it. The fact that it was already two projects living in one space. Another aspect was that I had been fundraising for Ladybird, specifically, starting in 2023, really, when I got a big sponsorship from Shopify. Yeah. So they went out on a limb and decided to support Ladybird, which I'm very grateful for. They were the first ones to do so with such a big sponsorship. And I guess that was the first time I realized, oh, maybe there's like bigger interest in this than I thought. Because I'd been already living off of sponsorships at this point for over a year. So Patreon and GitHub sponsors and stuff like that. Nowhere near my big tech salary, but enough to get by.
More satisfying, I'm sure.
I mean, I could eat healthy and go to the gym, and that's what I care about.
Yeah.
So I discovered that people were willing to give us money if we just focused on this specific thing that I was focusing on anyway. But in order to create a structure around receiving such donations, I mean, Shopify were very nice about this because they just gave me the donation in cash to me personally. But that didn't feel like a proper business structure.
Yeah.
So they were super cool about it. But I felt like if we want to do this more times, I should probably have a corporation. And so I stumbled into almost Chris Wanstroth, the co-founder of GitHub, at a like a year after the. No, not a year after. It was a few days after the Shopify donation that we got in touch. And it was just by accident because he tweeted about Serenity OS. So I just reached out to him and I asked like, hey, cool. You like Serenity? Do you like browsers too? Essentially. And we got to talking and connected over this idea of like building a open source browser and trying to maybe avoid the mistakes that we both felt that other open source browsers have been making, especially with regards to how they pay for stuff.
Yes. Yes, I could think of one in particular.
Right. And that's sort of where we connected.
Yeah. I feel like there's so much more we could talk about here, but I feel like there is anonymous presence in the room, and that is the browser itself. And it would be awesome if we don't mind jumping into a screen share at this point to actually just see what it looks like. I mean, I played around with it in the past. I'm sure everybody knows what a browser looks like, but let's have a look at what Ladybird looks like.
All right. So let's fire this up.
Okay.
Let's see.
Oh, so this has definitely changed a little, yeah.
Yes. So this is live. Current master branch just built it. So let's hope that nothing falls apart.
Oh, don't look it up. No, please don't.
Let's go to your website.
God, I've not tried it on Ladybird.
Me neither. But it seems to be working all right. Scrolling nicely.
Yeah. I need to change
Oh
quite a lot of
wow,
things.
we even
But
do
yes.
the blur underneath here. That's pretty good.
I haven't in dark mode. It's the least tested.
I
but
see.
yes.
Yes.
It's mostly using Tailwind, so it
Okay.
should.
Yeah, I've been having a
Yeah.
lot of success with Tailwind websites.
Uh,
So let's see.
yeah.
This goes somewhere else. Let's click on that.
Yeah, this will go
Okay.
to the. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're loading a couple of different sites here, as you can see. It's handling them pretty nicely. It's a little bit hit and miss. Like sometimes everything just works out of the box, and other times you can run into a brick wall if we're missing some API, for example, that some website would need. But a lot of things work surprisingly okay. Let's see.
This would be
Google Maps. Not terrible.
No, I'm pretty sure last time I looked, a lot less worked, but that was a while ago. So yes.
I'm gonna throw the little Google Maps man here. Yeah. Oh, even this works. That's cool.
I like the fact you're surprised as well.
Yeah, well, I haven't tested it in a long time. Yeah, so where might we go? Why don't you hit me with something and we'll see what happens?
Yeah, so actually, I'm a little bit interested. I hate the fact that this is the word we use when we're talking about browsers, but I'm interested in a little bit of the Chrome.
Okay.
So I'm guessing the plus button is open a new
This
window,
is a new tab.
I suppose. A new tab, yeah. And the 4 squares is kind of like a tab picker, yeah. So this is looking like you've drawn some inspiration as well from Safari a little bit, which is reasonable,
I suppose,
I'm guessing.
So the Chrome, as we have to call it, we haven't spent that much time on it. We're really focusing on the engine part because it is it's the most important and the hardest to get right.
Fundamentally. Yeah. Also, I'm always a sucker for settings. What can you change?
Not many settings at the moment.
Not much. Okay. Okay. All right. Let's. And you have an inspector.
I do, but it's very bare bones. So you can.
And it's also custom, I'm guessing.
It's custom. It's made with web content. So we're kind of dog fooding the engine in itself here. And it's one of our weaker areas, but it's something that we have to step up and improve. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I don't know. It's the funny thing is knowing how much is behind the scenes when you actually open a browser. You mean fundamentally it's not that interesting because most of it happens in the big bit in the middle. So
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, we can look at websites, but they just look like websites.
Exactly. It's like, it's a website. Whoop-de-doo. Okay. So maybe if you're up for it, let's have a look at a little bit of code. Not going into any great detail because there's a lot there, but just to get an idea for people who don't, a browser is almost a mini operating system in this modern era. So what kind of things do you need? And you talked about the rendering engine. And I think it may or may not be known to a lot of people that despite what browser you're using, there's basically only 3 rendering engines. I think
3 main ones
mostly
today.
For the most part. Yeah. And you started from scratch. So
right.
So what was that like?
It was almost like a compulsion initially. I just had to work on a browser again. I just missed it. But it grew very organically. So it really started. I mean, where do I have that? I have it somewhere on my GitHub, I think, the original source code for the browser.
I feel like I came across that at some point in the past as well, yeah.
Let's see if I can even find that. But it was originally just a very simple HTML parser that would sort of parse HTML and then print out the tree. And my goodness, I forgot what I call that thing.
Wasn't
here it is. Melt.
Lib? Oh no.
Yeah, I don't know why it was called Melt. but it was the first code doodle that eventually became Ladybird.
Code doodle. I like that. We could call that a coodle. Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. Melt.
Let's see if we can get it to load.
Ironically, GitHub seems to struggle a little bit.
A little bit,
Ladybird,
yeah. It's a pretty heavy site.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
true.
originally it was just this little chunk of C++ that had a simple parser, and it would build up a little document tree with the elements in your HTML. And it didn't follow any specs or anything like that. Very, very simple. And now that I look at it, I see that it didn't even have a parser, actually. It just had a pretend parser where it ignored the input and created exactly the tree that I wanted. So that was apparently how it started. I remembered it having a parser, but that was... It was very hello world. It literally says hello world. Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess I just started sort of modeling these concepts that a browser has internally. And I'd worked on browsers for so many years, so I knew sort of what the big chunks that I needed was. I needed a document object model, or the DOM. I needed CSS. I needed JavaScript. I needed layout, rendering, all those kind of components. So I just sort of picked one part and started painting. And as apparently we can see here that I started with the DOM. So like the basic objects like elements, text, document. And then just grew like fungus outward from there. And it looks completely different today, but this is sort of the foundation of it. If we look at the HTML parser today, let's see. It is a slightly bigger thing, 5,000 lines.
Yeah.
And it is a quite faithful implementation of the HTML parsing algorithm, which is like excruciatingly detailed. We can open it up here. And they've done just an amazing job with it. And the fact that we can build a compatible browser today is in no small part thanks to the standardization efforts of the people who did all this. So we've implemented this big chunky thing, word for word. Some parts are missing because we didn't encounter any need for them yet, but it does handle much of the web. And the way we write our code is that we tend to mirror the spec really closely. So if we look at, for example, when you are in the body element, then we have a link here above the function that you can open it up in your browser, and you'll see that it has the steps here that you're supposed to do. And we take the steps from the spec, put them as comments here. I see that actually this particular line is missing, but we have like, here's what you're parsing, here's how you should behave. And then we interleave spec text and code. So it makes it very easy to map the code back to the spec. For anybody who's new to the code base, this is a way for them to sort of immediately get up to speed on how this thing works. And it was an investment that we made early on. Many people told us that it was a tedious way of programming, but it's paid off immensely because we've been able to onboard so many people onto this complicated thing.
It's sort of internal documentation.
Yeah, indeed.
I suppose. So you mentioned the spec a lot here. So is this a justification to create a new browser in that some of the better known ones don't follow the specs closely enough? Or?
I think it's a justification. We're really working with a lot of different justifications blended together in a soup here. But at the end of the day, different people have different reasons for working on this. And there are some people who just love this aspect, that we're sticking to the spec and we're modeling the spec concepts as closely as we can. And that's amazing that gets them excited. And we even have people from the W3C who now actively hang out in our community and actively contribute to Ladybird. And this is sort of what got them interested. Should I end the screen share, by the way?
Okay. Sure. Yeah. We can, because we're starting to get It's been a very interesting conversation, but we should probably start.
It's all good. I can go endlessly.
So no, that's. I have to head back to Swedish. Our cat's got. I won't keep this in the recording. Our cat's got de-sexed yesterday, and I was in the house all day. I needed to get out the house. I have like my own little office space I rent. I need to get out the house today, but I also don't want to leave them alone too long. So
sure. But let me just expand on the motivations a little bit. So sticking to the spec is one big reason that a lot of people like what we're doing, and it's a big part of why we want to make a browser. We want to make one that follows the specs and that proves that the specs are implementable. But there are totally different justifications for making a browser as well. If you look at the browser market, it has been in decline, I would say. And I don't think anybody from the hacker community would disagree with this, that it's power has been concentrating with a small number of very, very rich companies. And even if it's not directly, then indirectly, because those companies are then paying other companies to build browsers.
Yeah, which could change a little, depending with the current stuff happening in the American courts. But we'll see, I suppose.
But our concept is that we feel that there should be a browser that isn't beholden to the advertising industry or anybody else for funding. And so we want to build this strictly supported by donations. And the donations are all no strings attached. So you can't get us to do anything other than put your logo on our website and say, thank you very much. Because we feel that the world should have a browser like that. Even if, we can't throw 1,000 engineers at performance, and we don't have billions of dollars to work with, we do believe that we can build something that's useful to people, and something that can work well enough that people would like it. So that's sort of the big justification for creating a nonprofit corporation to run the project, and for fundraising to continue developing, is that we feel that this is something that could be good for the world to have this.
Do you think, so some of the companies that have done this, Shopify you mentioned, Shopify have sponsored a few open source projects and created some of their own over the years. Actually, their Berlin office is like 5 minutes from me. And some others on here, some I know, some I don't. Is it just because they want to see this, or do they possibly want to use components in some of their own tools? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has their own reasons for sponsoring, but I think the big thing that everybody has in common is that they're all engineering first companies and engineer led, and they are just excited about the idea of a new browser. And we've all sort of been shepherded into this reality where a big advertising company controls the web, and we've accepted that that's just the way things are. And then the idea that maybe it doesn't have to be that way, I think that really appeals to people.
Yeah.
Even if it's just a dream. At this point.
So I feel like there's so many other things I'd love to ask you technically. I won't, because they could go on forever. But just, some of the things I like about browsers are not always the rendering engine. It is the Chrome, and we haven't even got into the subject of adding extensions and things, which is, I know, quite complex. I mean, it's even taken other fairly well-known browsers quite a while to make their extension frameworks more extensible. Like Safari, for example, has only just become more compatible with Chromium web extensions, things like that recently. This is a whole other complexity. You also have aspects of like syncing and all these sorts of things that bigger browsers have. But I think more fundamentally, I sort of feel like this is not really your intention, but I've always had this concern about projects that are popular and have a reasonable amount of users, but then fund themselves entirely on donations. how far could you go? I suppose or does that at this moment in time does that matter? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. Our thinking is that we know already that we'll never have the budget of our competition. We will be a tiny fraction. Today we have something like 0.1% of the budget of our competitors, and it's unlikely to ever get to 1%. So we know that, and because we know that, we can set a bunch of rules for ourselves. Like, we're going to keep the team small. We're going to keep the scope narrow. We're not going to aim for having complete feature parity with other browsers. There are things that we're not going to be able to do, at least not immediately. And we're just going to have to work at a different pace, focus on the important features first. Maybe we're not going to have, for example, like print to PDF in the first version, or
there's ways of doing it.
But like, there are all these amenities, let's say, in browsers that require engineering effort, and we're going to have to be way more choosy than other browsers. But I think if we narrow down the scope, we are going to be able to put out something. And our thinking right now is that we're going to aim for putting out an alpha in 2026. And it's very ambitious. Anybody who knows what goes into a browser can see that. Some people who don't know about browsers, they think that it's too long and they don't understand why we need so much time, but that's okay. But our thinking is that if we make something in 2026 that people see that, okay, this could really be a good thing, then more funding will come at that point. And we'll.
Okay.
But right now, we just have to prove that we can put something together that's compelling.
Yeah. So, final question. I think it is obviously quite an interesting time for browsers. We are probably coming back to almost a little bit of a time like the early 2000s, late 90s around variety of browsers. There are others that are also interesting. They all generally use their own engine, but in 2026, as you say, to some people that seems like a long way away. But there's so many things you could do. I can see on the website, singular focused.
Yes.
But a year is still a reasonable amount of time. So what, out of all the things that could happen, out of all the contributions that people could come up with, what roughly is on that roadmap for that release?
For the alpha release? So we have a bunch of different things. The first and most important thing is just a list of websites that we want to work correctly, and with reasonable performance and responsiveness, so that you can log into your Twitter, your LinkedIn, your Facebook, all of these kind of things. You can read your Gmail, all the big websites. We want them working, perhaps not with full fidelity, I don't think we're going to be able to do YouTube video in the first version, for example.
Okay. Is this because of DRM or?
A bunch of different factors just APIs that we have to implement. I don't have a full picture of everything that's needed, so I can't say specifically everything, but it's fairly complicated. And one issue that we're having is that we have to figure out the things that give the most benefit across the board, right? So, you could spend a bunch of time getting Quake 3 to play really well in the browser, but maybe that doesn't benefit most websites, even though it's fun to do that kind of stuff. But that's kind of what we're aiming for. We want to have broad compatibility at reduced fidelity with a large part of the popular web. And then underneath that is like a bunch of technical goals. Like, we want to have like these CSS features, these JavaScript features. We want to hit these performance targets on these benchmarks. But we have 6 people working full time on this project right now. And yes.
6. Wow.
Soon to be 7. And we also have a community of independent contributors around it that work on whatever they feel like, essentially. No coordination, at least no hierarchical coordination. And it's going okay. We're making good progress.
Yeah.
But some of the work ahead is less glamorous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we are deferring on a bunch of things that are a little bit not popular. So we're deferring on Windows, for example.
Yeah. Mobile,
Yep.
I can, because iOS outside of Europe
Right.
is basically locked down browser wise, isn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So we're deferring on some big things that people are not super happy about, but it's just a necessity given our constraints.
Yep. This is why a browser takes a while. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think in my mind, I try not to use Chromium browsers, and every time I have to, like I am at the moment, because a lot of websites just don't work in anything but Chromium. That to me says why this is needed. They don't follow standards enough, and people will kind of. I tend to prefer to use Safari for a bunch of different reasons. And when people say, "Oh, don't use Safari, it's broken," it's like, no, it's the dominance of one browser is actually what's broken things. But so, people, it's like the old days when we all designed for Internet Explorer. It's the same kind of problem again. So if people did design to the spec, then a project like Ladybird can exist and function out of the box with minimal effort. But people don't. So
Indeed. Indeed.
Yeah. All right. Well, amazing. That's ladybird.org. Of course, people can download, build if they want to. If people are interested in getting involved on a more active side of things, but maybe kind of nitty gritty C++ is not their thing, because to be blunt, it's not many people's thing. Are there other areas where people can get involved?
Well, C++ is definitely the main way to get involved at the moment, but there is increasing value in just finding websites that don't work correctly and then figuring out why. So if you can put in a little bit of time to diagnose why something doesn't work, and perhaps even create like a minimal test case, like a single HTML file that demonstrates the problem, so you don't have to wade through like a megabyte of minified JavaScript and stuff. That is super valuable, and you don't need any C++ skills. Anybody who's done web development can do that, and that's super valuable.
Amazing. Well, that was a fascinating conversation. We kind of walked all over computing history. Andreas, thank you very much for your time.
Sure. Thanks for having me.